So the Revolutionary War was over. We know that in 1783. But it begs the question, of course, was the American Revolution over? There were changes, and they were significant, and there were other things that didn't change a lot. And that's too bad. But it has to be taken with a feeling of perspective. George Robert 12 Hughes was someone who experienced change. He joined the militia in New England. He also went on to become a privateer. And at the end of the American Revolution, he was called out by someone who thought, well, you know, you were basically a petty servant when this whole conflict began. And Hughes said, yeah, maybe I was, but I'm not going to take my hat off to you anymore. And that seemed like a small thing, but it happened. Joseph Plum Martin enlisted twice. He was 15 or 16 when he enrolled in the Continental Army. He fought, he writes one of the best memoirs, a revolutionary soldier. And he lived through Valley Forge, and he saw some of the fighting throughout the Revolution. Leaves the Continental Army and says, you know, the people who made decisions, who were officers, weren't always the best folks. They were, to their dying day, elitists. And he gets elected to public office after his career in the American Revolution and becomes a Jeffersonian. Again, where many of the officers in the Continental Army were Federalists. Again, kind of enhancing the status quo of the American Revolution, connected to the Constitution, the idea that it is a more conservative revolution. And so, you know, Jefferson's election in 1800 seems to be a significant change. That's why if you want to attach change to the revolution, you can easily carry it to 1800. Jefferson did. I mean, he called it the Revolution of 1800. And we think, oh, it's just another election. But he thought it was something more than that. Because if you consider that the revolution is still being fought politically about what it meant, yeah, you can adopt Jefferson's opinion and say, sure, yeah, maybe it makes sense. You know, one party had been in charge for 12 years. You had Washington and Adams in office, and then a change of political party, of parties that the founders didn't anticipate, should have, but didn't. And it happened peacefully, and that was a big deal. You know, nobody died. I mean, hearts were broken, but we don't see the French Revolution happen in the United States. And if you want to judge a revolution by body counts, maybe ours isn't the one you should go by. But as we're going to find out, the casualties were very high, which surprised a lot of folks, considering the population is a fraction of what it was during the American Civil War, during World War II. And these are wars where we know the casualties for the United States were pretty substantial. At the Randolph family plantation, Tuckahoe in Virginia, a captured British officer is appalled when he sees a couple of everyday townsfolk come in to the Randolph's estate, this big manor home in Virginia, pull their muddy boots off by the fire, proceed to then spit in the fire as they are having a conversation with members of the Randolph family. They leave, put their muddy boots back on, and this officer is just absolutely just shocked. I mean, what's going on? And the Randolph members of the family just kind of shake their heads and say, that's the way things are now. It just creates, in some ways, a sea change in the attitude of people throughout now the new United States. And maybe that's something. I mean, the words that people use to describe themselves and their bosses and their social betters, this whole deference idea of a society where certain people were in charge and the rest simply said, okay, certain people are in charge and I'm not, and I'll let them run things. I think all of those ideas were kind of blown up. So the American Revolution is not a revolution in the sense of it being radical or total change. It's a reordering of politics, but it's not an overturning of the political system. It's not, in other words, the French or Russian Revolution. What you might say accurately about the American Revolution is that it is an accelerated evolution, a revolution that evolves and just doesn't, okay, all the changes happened by 1783. No, it takes longer. If that doesn't satisfy your particular criteria for the revolution is, the American Revolution isn't very, again, radical. But if you stretch the idea to say forces were let go that challenged the way people thought about things, maybe that is revolutionary. During the conflict, and this is not, by the way, to remind all of you, this is not a total war, even though we talk about the military campaign, we talk about the lead up to it, spent a lot of time on the lead up to it. During the conflict, people went on working, they went on playing, they went on praying, and some towns were hardly in realization that there was a war going on. There were whole communities that were, for the most part, generally untouched. But striking changes did occur. It affected the social customs of the nation, the political institutions, the expectations of how you run things, and who should be in politics, and the ideas about society. Now, for everyone who thinks this is going to be a game changer in the aftermath, there are just as many people who think, maybe not. Let's put the brakes on this. There's arguments now that there are two American revolutions. There's one in 1776 and there's one in 1787. The 1787 revolution says, okay, the forces we unleashed 10 years ago, we've got to slow down. And this is why you have Constitutional Convention. Again, an active argument. An active argument. Was the Constitution an anti-democratic document? Okay. Still 200 plus years, we're debating that. Well, we know 80,000 loyalists were affected by the American Revolution. Possibly 30 to 40,000 of them left and went to other places around the British Empire. They went to Canada, some went to East Florida, Jamaica, the Bahamas, some went back to England. They took 15,000 slaves with them. Reading the Nash book, he says it is, and this is an argument that you can abide by, agree with, or disagree with. He says that it is the revolution, especially in the South, one of the greatest slave rebellions in American history. Again, whether or not you believe that or not, you can look at the evidence. It robbed the 80,000 loyalists and those among the total that left. It robbed the American revolutionary world, or the post-war world, of a more conservative base for politics. This is what we generally put the loyalists into, this idea that we don't support this possible radical change, because we know what the loyalists argued as far as what the revolutionaries really wanted. They were levelers, right? That was the word they used. They were going to turn the economic and social order and political world upside down. And those who don't want that to happen, who remain loyal to Great Britain, leave. And they're not in charge anymore. You know, these were royal officials who are gone, and someone has to take their place. So that's significant. That means something. It also weakened the aristocratic upper crust of the American colonies. There is no title nobility in the American colonies. You know, Lord so-and-so is a British subject, but it's someone who was born in England. There's an aristocracy of wealth, but not of titles in the American colonies. So with these loyalists gone, it paves the way for a new group of patriot elite to emerge. Now, who's going to rule and who should rule at home? This is a two-sided question that one historian asked in the 1930s. Who should rule and who should rule at home? The different levels of the American Revolution. So for loyalists who are without their property, again, they're not lined up and shot and hanged. And we don't have anything like that happening in the American Revolution. Yeah, people died, not by the hundreds or even by the thousands. This was a brutal conflict, lest we forget. I think I tried to make that clear, and it should be clear when we talk about the casualties that were involved. So the Declaration declared that all men are created equal, but we have to challenge this idea and see, was it prevalent? Was the idea, the words written by Jefferson and the committee and the Congress, actually, did it become a reality? Was it a sentiment that people truly believed beyond 1776? there were changes. Most states reduced but did not eliminate the property holding requirements to be able to vote. That's significant change. Radical change? Maybe not. Pennsylvania, Delaware, North Carolina, and Georgia all said the same thing. Any male taxpayer could vote. Okay, that's different than you have to, absolutely have to hold land to be able to vote. For elected office, you usually had to own some land. So there's a couple of different tiers for land ownership. If you didn't own any, you could vote in some states. If you had to own some land to be able to vote, to be able to hold office. Again, you show your investment and interest in society. You have a stake in where you live if you actually own land. That was the mentality in the colonial time. And it changed a little bit. I mean, you can own a store and not a parcel of land, although most people who owned a shop and ran something like that did have a parcel of land. But if you only had a store, why are you denied the right to vote? It's a good question. So they changed the rules during and after the Revolution. New rules for Western counties emerged. How about if more people live out west, you organize new counties and more counties? You actually reflect the population in a given state. That's a great idea. Reacting to the demands and the grievances during the 1760s and 70s. Capitals are moved from the old colonial capitals to sometime locations further west. New Bern, North Carolina. Nope. Raleigh. Charleston, South Carolina. Columbia, South Carolina. And so on and so forth. Philadelphia. Nope. Harrisburg. Some of these changes happened after the American Revolution, but it's reflective of the fact that the coastal elite thought they could run the colony and neglect the West. Oh, more people live in what's now Orange County, North Carolina? Okay, we'll just draw a giant county out there. Well, that's great, but Orange County sends 2 representatives and all the other eastern counties in North Carolina. This goes back to the ideas of the regulation in North Carolina. The idea that the East is going to control by virtue of there being more counties there, yet more people live in the West. So that changes. What we would call the principle of apportionment. You apportion the representation based on where people actually lived. Ordinary men and women demand that they be addressed in the aftermath of the revolution as Mr. and Mrs. They're not by the elite, by the people that employ them. Again, maybe just a small change in language, but it matters in some ways. Employers were now called boss, not master. What's that? Kind of good? Yeah, I mean, that's what we can say about that. It's kind of good. I mean, it's not hugely, I mean, it's not like those who were the masters were now the servants. I mean, that's what some people were fearing, especially those who were loyalists. New York frees in the aftermath of the revolution, and entire shiploads of servants who arrive. They were supposed to be indentured servants for a given amount of time. Nope, that ends. By 1800, servitude is virtually unknown in the United States. Trade organizations begin to grow to help laborers and artisan workers. They already existed before. We would call them guilds, or more modern term, unions. They accelerate during the aftermath, a common cause in what they do. Not certainly their economic situation, but bricklayers or masons or shipwrights or people who work in different professions. The states also drop primogeniture laws in the aftermath of the revolution, which is Latin meaning firstborn gets like everything. Firstborn son to inherit all the property of the family. That changes. States do that on their own. This doesn't come from up high on Congress, but it changes from the states. Not all at one time, over the course of the 1770s and the 1780s. There is also, in the area of American religion, a protracted fight for a separation of church and state. This is yet another topic that is a hot button issue to this day. The idea of Jefferson's quote, there should be a wall between separation of church and state. Again, the revolution, this is what's revolutionary about it. We created the idea that you can have a republic that doesn't have an official faith. Now, that doesn't mean that within the states, there are not still tax-supported churches. There are. At the national level, that ends. That ends. So we'll go through these changes as we continue. There are notable gains in this principle, the separation of church and state. Not as much in the Congregational church, the old Puritan church. In many cases, they continue to be the established church, meaning tax-supported church, in areas of New England, well into the 1820s, until finally folks say, look, with the other dissenting Protestant faiths, the old Puritan hold on the faith in that particular state has to end, and they did. But it took a while. It happened very quickly in the South, because the Anglican Church was the official church in all Southern colonies, the tax-supported church, the Anglican Church. But the Anglican Church is connected to England, so that has to end. It's the church of the status quo, the establishment. And so it came undone during and after the Revolution. The South is de-Anglicized, in other words. And it reforms itself. It doesn't go away. But they reconstitute themselves as the Protestant Episcopal Church. And everywhere it is disestablished. Again, it doesn't mean it's not legitimate, it's not important to people's lives. It just means that people who don't set foot in an Anglican now, of course, Episcopal Church, have to pay a tax to support it. That changes. The struggle for divorce from government and religion lasts longer in Virginia, where it holds out until 1786. Thomas Jefferson considers it one of his most lasting accomplishments when he drafts the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom. He works with dissenters who include Baptists to make this happen. Again, if 1783 is the cutoff, okay, it didn't happen before then, it happened after. So it takes a while. Well, one of the areas that we see some change, but not dramatic enough, and certainly to our modern eyes, is in the changes in slavery. In 1773, Boston slaves demanded more fair treatment from the British governor when they claimed, we have no property. Meaning they can't control themselves. They have not the ability to get their own freedom within Boston. Slaves in Boston? Oh, yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Maybe not so much in areas in the outlying countryside, but where slavery existed, it existed in New England cities. William Henry Drayton of South Carolina is shocked at impertinent slaves that he comes across after 1775. He says, quote, they claim that the present contest with Great Britain was for obliging us to give them liberty, unquote. So you hear that in diaries and letters and correspondence of people who lived during the American Revolution. Words like, the slaves have become insolent. Well, they're not ignorant of the different rhetoric that's being used, and they believe it applies to them. The irony, of course, in all this discussion is that the British give slaves more chances at freedom than those who were fighting for independence. The promise to freedom to slaves or indentured servants who bear arms for the loyalist cause. This started with Lord Dunmore's proclamation in 1775. I mean, it causes ripples to go through the American South. The British recruitment of slaves in Virginia stuns Patriot leaders. 40% of the population in Virginia is black in 1775 and 1776. The British give them uniforms, Dunmore's regiment, that say liberty, either across a sash or on the headgear that they wear. The strategy backfired, but the Ethiopian regiment, as it came to be called, made more patriots out of those who were neutral. I don't care what side. I mean, the British are corrupt. These people who are running the colony are corrupt. I don't care who wins this whole contest of constitutional ideas. And then you heard about what Dunmore did, and it turns the war into something else. It makes patriots out of neutrals, people who say, either way, it doesn't matter to me. Oh, wait, he's promising to liberate slaves. That, in my translation, means a race war. That's why at first the British walked away from Lord Dunmore's proclamation. In the South, the revolution is about keeping slavery. In the South, it's about keeping the institution of slavery, and it pushes those who were loyal, possibly, to the patriot side. I'll stick to Great Britain through thick and thin. And now you hear about what Dunmore has promised to do, liberate slaves who take up arms. He said that is a carte blanche, blank check invitation of slaves to move, leave, if not uprise and kill me, at least to leave my farm or plantation and to go to Dunmore. Up to this point, I was willing to side with Great Britain in this constitutional struggle, and that just became a game changer. So that's why you can say that it pushes those who were loyal to the patriot side. That's why England kind of stepped back and said, wait a minute, Dunmore, when you promise that, we want only the slaves who were slaves of people who were, again, patriots, those who were being disloyal, the treasonous Virginians, to march to your banner, not those who were loyal. But how do you make that promise and then say, oh, we only mean, so those of you slaves who are understanding and reading this, those of you who are actually those who are owned by patriots. It's difficult to do that. But the egalitarian sentiments unleashed by the war does challenge the institution of slavery. There are societies that form to oppose it. One of the first in 1775 are American Quakers in Pennsylvania, who start the first anti-slavery group in the American colonies. They thought they could seize on the actions of the Continental Congress and appeal to ending the slave trade. That's where abolitionists first attacked slavery, the slave trade. They called the noxious trade in slaves black ivory. Congress asks and gets temporarily a complete stop in the overseas trade of slaves. Why? Well, there's a connection to the idea it would enrich the British Empire. And so if we're going to cut off all trade, that includes trade in slaves. Of course, Southerners were hoping this would not last very long. Several states go further after 1775. They either abolish slavery or provide for a gradual emancipation. Again, it depends on the state. There's no from the high declaration of Congress as far as what you should do, individual states, about slavery. There couldn't be. We wouldn't have a revolution. Vermont, in its state constitution, simply makes slavery illegal. Yeah, it's easy in New England, where 1% of your population is enslaved, but something changes. Massachusetts in 1780 promises what they call in the Constitution, quote, liberty for all. And so the New England states make it go away. In 1780, the year that the new state constitution of Massachusetts is written, also an important year in Pennsylvania, all children born to slave mothers would be free at 28 years old, and the state would pay the owner. 28, I'm not sure why they came up with that number. Some states it was 20, 18, 25. Again, we don't have it's always going to be done this way. The individual states did it their own way. That meant there would be slaves in Pennsylvania and New York and New Jersey well into the 1840s. I mean, if you were born literally before that and you lived up until that time, you'd still be enslaved. You didn't qualify. It's those slaves who were born in 1780 and after. New York lags. They finally declare 1827, July 4th, 1827, the 51st anniversary of the Declaration, as a date of emancipation for all people held in slavery. Even on Virginia plantations, some owners free their human chattel. There are individual acts of freedom, manumission it's called. Slave owner, just by the fact that his conscience is bothered, or he has an abundance of slaves because population of slaves are growing almost as quickly as the white population, which means doubling every 25 years. What do you do with excess slaves that you don't need? You can't employ and put to work. Well, you don't have to pay them. That's not an issue. But you can free them at a certain age or when they are young. That's up to the state. States can be restrictive about that, or states can allow the owners to do that through individual acts. And usually it comes with the rule that once you free someone that you own, you must ship him or her out of the state, make them some other state's problem, where upon being free, it's not a paradise by any stretch of the imagination for them. Slaves who support independence won their freedom, and in some cases, a parcel of land in the West. You're reading about that in the Nash book. The British liberate 15, 20,000 slaves in the course of the war. They do more to make it look like a slave rebellion than those who are favoring independence. Like the Loyalists, they have to find these slaves a new home after 1783. Some go to Canada, the Caribbean, or go to other colonies, scatter. The American patriots, of course, show very little mercy to blacks who help the British cause. Often they suffer whipping or punishment or some other kind of, again, retribution for having aided the British. Thomas Jeremiah is a black man who's hanged and burned because he told South Carolina slaves that the British were there to help them. Again, this appeals to the very worst of human nature when it's going to invoke the possibility of a slave rebellion or an all-out race war. White loyalists who were caught encouraging slaves to escape were often tarred and feathered and punished. So it's limited. Thousands of free blacks and runaway slaves may have fought in the war. We're not sure how many. The vast majority of African Americans did not so much choose sides as they chose freedom. Who can offer it? Is it the Patriot side or the British side? Many freed themselves by simply going north. Getting out of the South is the ticket to freedom, or joining a British regiment, joining and filling a quota, going in the place of my owner and joining a militia unit or a Continental Army unit. But the revolution of sentiments associated with all men are created equal were sadly incomplete. No state south of Pennsylvania abolishes slavery in the 1770s or the 1780s. In both the North and South, laws were put in place to discriminate against free blacks and slaves alike. Many states bar them from owning property, holding certain jobs, educating their children. There are still laws against interracial marriage that show up on the books in states in the North. It was an incomplete change in the American Revolution, and no one recognized it more than Thomas Jefferson. In 1785, he said, "I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just, that his justice cannot sleep forever," unquote. And like other whites, he could never, ever seem to bring himself to free his slaves. Some did, others didn't. Washington did, and everyone's like, oh, Washington did, yay. Well, it's when Washington's wife died, not when he died. They'd still be enslaved until Martha passed. So it's up to the individual, obviously, and the change is limited. The great question, of course, is why in this dawning of this democratic age did abolition not go further after the war? The short answer to it is that the idealism of the time was sacrificed for political expediency. Do you want slavery to end, or you want a nation? That's what it comes down to. James Madison said that at some point. It causes a divide. The fight over slavery would be and would have fractured any kind of national unity. And so they had to make compromises. James Madison said, great as the evil of slavery is, a dismemberment of the Union would be worse, unquote. There you have it. Sacrifice the idea of making more dramatic change to slavery to keep the country together. Well, we did that for, decades of our existence. It took almost a century for this divide to happen, but it finally did, the irrepressible conflict that leads to 1861. Likewise, incomplete is the extension of the doctrine of equality to women. Women served in the military. We know that in different capacities, whether it be camp followers or we talked about Molly Hayes at the Battle of Monmouth. And in New Jersey, women were allowed the right to vote if they met property requirements. That happened in some communities throughout the United States in the 1770s and 1780s. Abigail Adams, we almost always seem to, in accounts of the Revolution, that letter in 1776 comes up again and again with the famous quote to remember the ladies. But if you read more into it, it is Abigail telling John, you will foment a rebellion, she promises, if women are not given political rights. And John, of course, answers in the most condescending manner you can. Oh, we'll never, ever think of abandoning or throwing over our manly institutions. Yeah, it was awkward there for a little while. It took almost, again, it took the revolution to create new opportunities for women, but they were, for the most part, doing traditional work in 1783 and after 1783. I mean, I'm drawing parallels to what I'm talking about in another class when we have, again, hundreds of thousands of women flying planes during World War II from one area of the country to another. The WASPs, they were called, Women's Air Corps. They were the Rosie the Riveter, most famous image of the war as far as in the home front. You know, we can do it. Woman, you know, making the muscle there with her arm. And then afterwards, it was literally told to American women who were now thrust into these jobs when that they were taking because men were off, 10 million, 15 million men fighting in the war. Okay, they're coming back to these jobs, go back to home. And it happened without a lot of things said like, well, no, and we don't want to, and we want to work. And so the parallels are there, I think. The legal status of women in the colonies up to 1776 were governed by, just like the legal status of children, you know, primogeniture laws. The laws were regulated by the British common law. And essentially, women were treated like children. I mean, legally, when you look at it from an objective perspective. They couldn't vote or hold office, with some exceptions for voting. Married women had no right to buy, sell, or manage their own property, with few exceptions. Sometimes you could buy land. Abigail Adams bought land when her husband was out of the country. There's a rare exception. For the most part, couldn't control your own property. Technically, it was called coverture, this idea that once you were married, I mean, single women had more control of their property, but there are not a lot of single women. I mean, there's an expectation that you get married. And you know, you have to. It's kind of the rule. Well, no, it's not a rule, but that was the expectation in the colonial period. Exactly. Yeah. But you had more control over your property if you remained single. But if you were remained single, you were like a pariah in society. What's wrong with her? She's not married. Again, very, very different world, obviously. Technically, any wages women earned belonged to their husband. They could not sue her husband for property. They could not testify in court, although the husband could testify against the wife. They could not enter a contract on their own. Divorces in colonial period, very, very difficult to obtain. You had to get in court and, oh yeah, you couldn't testify. I guess you needed men to go in there and testify to like spousal abuse and extreme circumstances because some of the churches in the different colonies just forbade divorce. It couldn't happen. A wife was obliged to obey her husband. Again, you were a dependent, like a child or a servant or a slave. You were dependent on someone else, so why would you have any control of your own property? That is the mindset of the 18th century, not only in the American colonies and the United States, but for the most part around the world. Yet women did not go untouched by the revolutionary ideology. Central is the concept of civic virtue. This is what women were told in the aftermath of the American Revolution. Democracy depended on the unselfish commitment of citizens to the public good. And women had to raise these good Republican citizens. That was their job. Who better to develop good little citizens like women who are mothers? Must do and should do their very best to cultivate the habits of virtuous citizens, a moral education at home. And that way we can have, through succeeding generations, the American Republic will continue to last and flourish. Selfless devotion of the mother to the family is the proper model of Republican behavior. The phrase they used, you see a lot at the time, was called Republican motherhood. It takes root in the revolutionary generation. It elevates women to a political role without going into politics. It's a prestigious role that books have been written on it. Republican motherhood was a subtitle in one of the things that happened. They are keepers of the nation's conscience. Educational opportunities may and did expand for women, that they should be educated the same way as men. The expectations were beginning to change, at least in some ways. But wives and mothers were the best people to cultivate the virtues of their sons and their husbands. The survival of the nation depended upon Republican motherhood, in other words. So this was what was said and touted in the literature, reinforced. Women did have changing new opportunities. That absolutely was the case, but it's one of the areas where we don't see the revolution as radically, again, shifting expectations, and that would take quite a bit longer. In some ways, the parallels are there with abolition and slaves. Another, of course, large and substantial group affected by the American Revolution are Native Americans, who, for the most part, sided with the British, with few exceptions. They're caught in the middle. There's a famous, again, quote, I think it's from the Cherokee, "We're caught between two fires." The Cherokee Indians, who for the most part did side with the British. Both sides used Indians as soldiers, but with that is the qualification that in no engagement did Indians tip the balance in favor of the British or the Patriots. We see accounts of Indians 50, 100, 150 fighting in places like New York, Pennsylvania. The Catawba Indians of South Carolina were already on a reservation, and we think, no, that's a 19th century word, but it isn't. The South Carolina representatives went to the Catawba and essentially said, you all need to stay out of this or join us or risk destruction, which the answer from them was like, we're kind of been destroyed by a smallpox epidemic of the 1760s. And the Catawba thought our best bet to keep the small area of land in South Carolina that we have is to side with the South Carolina forces, which they did. And they're one of a couple, the Stockbridge Indians, the Oneida Indians, again, that for the most part sided with the Patriot forces. The Iroquois Confederacy told all their 6 members, look, you choose on your own. I mean, the Tuscarora fought with the British, others fought with the Patriot. The Mohawk fought some with the Patriot forces in New York, some fought with the British. What you have to understand is that there isn't any kind of governing body of Native Americans. They made their own choices. I mean, sometimes we see these pan-Indian movements, right? We've got Pontiac's Rebellion we talked about, 1763, where he was kind of a lightning rod for Indians in the West, the Ohio Indians, to, again, attack the British fortifications there. You see another movement of pan-Indian nationalism around the War of 1812 with the prophet Tenskwatawa and his brother Tecumseh in the West operating before the War of 1812 actually starts. But those are really exceptions to the rule. For the most part, it's understood that the British provide the best access to trade goods, the best access to the gift giving, which returned after the American War in 1763, the French and Indian War. So not surprisingly, most Indians sided with the British. The Indians, saw that only the British can stop westward advancement. If the Patriot forces win, if the independence is achieved, it's all over for them. But there are atrocities committed on both sides. But for the Indians, most of the atrocities came from colonists who were settling the West on Indian land. One of the tragedy, of course, of the end of this story is that the British abandoned the Indians who had sided with them. They said, you're on your own. I mean, now the newly constituted United States extends to the Mississippi River, and we're gone as a force. I mean, we still have Canada, the British say, but you're basically on your own. That creates what we would call a no-win situation for Indians. No matter who wins, it's not going to be good for them. Congress, in the aftermath of the American Revolution, treated Indians as foreign nations. They weren't sure what kind of policy to put together. Some suggested that they be wards of the state. Maybe that would have been better. And that's where you can sign these treaties, treat the Indian nations as foreign entities. And the Congress, after 1783, wanted an orderly process. And Congress alone was supposed to dictate Indian policy, not leave it to the states. Left to the states, the Indians would have been in really worse shape. And so in the 1780s, the states surrendered all their claims in the West to Congress. That's when we have what they hope to be an orderly process. Congress would do it, not the different states. But the treaties that were put in place, those in 1785, 1786, especially among the Ohio Indians, a lot of the Indian leadership there basically ignored them. They rejected them. And why would they not? I mean, the Americans were drifting into Tennessee, Kentucky. Kentucky was, the book on Kentucky during the Revolution in the 1780s is called something like A Dark and Bloody Ground because of all the attacks back and forth that take place. It's not even a state until the 1790s. So with the British still maintaining forts in the West on American soil after the Revolution, it emboldens the Indians to say, look, we reject the treaties and we're going to continue to fight. In 1783 to 1790, 1,500 colonists, well, American settlers, we should say more accurately, die in the West. An untold number of Indians as well. There had been calls to make the Indian policy liberal as far as the 18th century world was. Henry Knox basically serves as Secretary of War before we had the job of Secretary of War in the Congress, suggested that. He's talking to Washington and other people saying, look, our legacy is going to be really much affected if we, don't treat them very well. I found a great quote from Knox. It is painful to consider that all the Indian tribes once existing in those states, now the best cultivated and most populous, have become extinct. If the same causes continue, he's referring now to what happens in the East. Where are the Indians in New England? In the East, he says they're basically extinct. Not true, but their numbers obviously are heavily affected and depleted. If the same causes continue, he says, the same effects will happen. And in a short period, the idea of an Indian on this side of the Mississippi will only be found in the pages of the historian. And that continues into when he's actually the Secretary of War in the first cabinet under Washington. They try to put together a coherent Indian policy, and it didn't work because it's undone by the states, specifically the state of Georgia and others. So that's where the changes are, of course, somewhat limited. And starting the next class in the spring, this is something I'll talk about. There are some critical failures of this founding generation. One is obviously to change and rethink the role of women, to end slavery or put it on the path to end, to treat Indians fairly, to address the idea of political parties that they knew were going to exist but didn't deal with in the framework of the Constitution. So the war. The war by the numbers was a bloody affair. This is what's often neglected because we think the battles were small and the casualties light in the American Revolution. They weren't. It had gone on for 8 years, 104 blood-drenched months of conflict, longer than anyone expected. And here's where, of course, the numbers are a little bit vague. We don't have good numbers. And sometimes they change. When I was an undergraduate, just to connect to a different story, the number of dead in the Civil War was 620,000 on both sides. Staggering. Now it's closer to 750. Where in the world did we lose 130,000 people? And the answer recently, like within the last 5 years, is that the Southern governments were so devastated and the Southern states so devastated that they just couldn't keep up with the count of the dead. So we've now taken that estimate up to 750,000 people on both sides. And that seems to be more accurate. We think about 100,000 different Americans served in the Continental Army at one point or another in the American Revolution. Countless thousands more served in the militia. Some served in the militia and the Continental Army. In some of the campaigns in the South, those militia units of Virginia and South Carolina were former Continentals, just reconstituted as militia. The war, of course, exacted what we would call today a ghastly toll. 25,000 Americans perish on that side. Again, as part of the population, it is significant. Historians believe that it is much higher. 25,000 is one of those kind of safe, we don't want to overestimate. Recently, they've come back and said maybe it's 30,000. Because there are questions we have to ask when we throw out that number. What happened to the 9,871 who are listed as wounded or missing in action? Are they militia? They're wounded, missing. So that's why we say, okay, let's take that number and make the estimate closer to 30,000. And even that's a conservative number, those who died serving in some capacity. That is to translate 1 in 16 of all men of military age, making it behind only the Civil War, which we consider to be the bloodiest conflict because not only the length of the war, but those who died on both sides. In the Civil War, 1 in 10 men of military age died. In the American Revolution, it's 1 in 16. Just to give you a comparison, it's 1 in 75 in World War II, which we think, oh, World War II, the casualties were staggering. Yeah, for most of the other countries involved. Not as much for the United States, though they are substantial. I mean, 50 million people died in World War II. Someone broke it down. I remember seeing the statistic. It's 3 every second. Every second, every day, from 1939 to 1945 in the war. That's soldiers and civilians. The Continental Army numbers, as far as those that were killed, who were part of the Continental Army, were 1 in 4. In the Civil War, the bloodiest war in American history as part of the population, it was 1 in 5. So again, if you just look at the Continental Army as opposed to all those, again, it's by population, pretty significant losses. Unlike subsequent wars where there were numerous soldiers who came home with disabilities, there aren't in this one. They all died. They died in a prison ship or they died in a hospital because medicine obviously wasn't very good. The seriously wounded didn't come home. They died of infection, shock, blood loss, or other horrible things. The British, meanwhile, sent 42,000 men to North America. 10,000 of them died. 1 in 4. 29,000 Hessians were sent. We know that by the middle years of the war, more of the Hessians were fighting in North America because the British had to redeploy to deal with the French. Out of those 29,000 Hessians, 7,500 died in combat. That's a staggering number as a percentage of those that went over. If you add the Loyalists, the French, and the Spanish, the death toll might push 100,000. Pretty significant. In a population of what, 3 million? That's a lot in America. Contemporaries on both sides contemplated the mystery of the war's outcome because immediately there is the fabled blame game that happens. The generals and the admirals on the British side, the king's advisors, were they all to blame, or was the war just simply unwinnable? Good question. Washington would later acknowledge he called it little short of a standing miracle that it actually was successful. Washington was the main reason it was successful. I think he played the long game. And so historians have had fun over the last 200 years about theories about what happened in the American Revolution. One that a lot of agree on, the British never sent over enough soldiers. That's what it comes down to. Their numerical advantage is never enough. Never enough. They always had more soldiers than were involved in the Continental forces, but it's never enough to end the rebellion. The French entry into the war is a game changer. There's no doubt about it. It changes what happens, and it makes it harder for the British to end a colonial rebellion. They now have to send their forces and the Royal Navy to other parts of the globe. The other problem is that there is never an overall commander for the British on the ground who had to make decisions right there and could be made independently to make decisions, because the British commanders, plural, there's only one American commander, had to wait for instructions to go back and forth across the Atlantic. That took some time. There was a lack of intelligence among the British as well, and an inability to ever use the Loyalists in any capacity that would have helped them. They always talked a good game about it, but it didn't really materialize. The Americans had issues too, supply problems throughout the entire rebellion, corruption and graft in the quartermaster department. Which wasn't cold necessarily. The next winter was even worse, but the supply system was abysmal for the Continental Army. We have a weak Congress that could not procure supplies or bend the states to support the war. What we did have, however, is Washington. He gets over the early struggles and impulsiveness. He's not a great general. Tactically, meaning when the battle starts, you want him to be the guy to make decisions. Strategically, brilliant. Tactically, not great. He ends up being a fantastic administrator who got along well with Congress and just dragged it out. You look at the correspondence of Washington during the war and you see the details captains would be dealing with and lieutenants would be handling, he handled. And it shouldn't have, but he did. That's a lot of the success of the American Revolution. So those debates continue about what was the key ingredient that made American independence successful. And again, still very much an active debate to this day. Okay, we've reached the end. We will, again, put up the final exam by Thursday, and you all just take a look at it, answer the questions that you choose to answer, get it back to me just by sending it as an email. The due date is Tuesday on that. So I'll accept them through Tuesday. Your last set of papers have been graded. Some of you may have already noticed that. Again, be complete, be thorough in your answers, whichever one you choose. Make sure you answer at least 150 words, which hasn't always been the case, and use examples and concrete arguments in your tackling of those individual questions. They come from the book. Some come from, of course, the lecture, including how revolutionary was the revolution, the Articles of Confederation, a few questions like that scattered throughout this last part of the class. Okay, we'll see everybody next time.